Hello, and welcome to the Word on the Streets October Book Talk. This month, author and illustrator Gord Hill is here to discuss the new edition of the 500 Years of Resistance, Indigenous Resistance comic book, out this month with Arsenal Pulp Press. In the guest interviewer seat, we have Molly Swain, co-host of Métis in Space. Before we dive into our discussion, we need to recognize the land we occupy. The Toronto of today exists because of the Toronto Purchase, also known as Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in 1805, with a final claim settlement in 2010. WOTS Toronto also recognizes the history of the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Seneca nations in this territory. The place in which WOTS operates is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. Toronto, or Toronto, is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples with long histories on this land, and acknowledging this is only the first step in building a practice of land stewardship and Indigenous solidarity that honors these peoples. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land you occupy wherever you're tuning in from. And now a bit of background on our guests. Gord Hill is a member of the Kwakwakwa Nation, whose territory is located on northern Vancouver Island and adjacent mainland in the province of British Columbia. His previous books include the Antifa comic book, the Anti-Capitalist Resistance comic book, and the first edition of this book, published as the 500 Years of Resistance comic book in 2010. He has been involved in Indigenous peoples and anti-globalization movements since 1990. Welcome, Gord. It's great to have you here today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And our guest interviewer today is Molly Swain, who is an Otipse-Esquew, born and raised in Treaty 7 and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 territory, and currently living in Amiskwatsy-Waskahigan on Treaty 6, M&A Region 4, and Nehiyakwad lands. She is a PhD student in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, studying 20th century Métis history and Métis anarchism. She is the co-host of Indigenous feminist science fiction podcast and land back project Métis in Space, a co-director of Métis in Space Land Trust, and a co-founder of Free Lands, Free Peoples, an Indigenous-led anti-colonial prairie penal abolition organization. Thank you so much for joining us today, Molly.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I'll leave it to you both.
Great. Hey, Gord.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah.
Cool. So I don't know how you wanted to start necessarily. Did you want to have a bit of a conversation? Would you like to start with a reading? How would you like to proceed?
Either way is good for me. Whatever you, however you'd like to do it.
Okay. Why don't we start with a reading so folks can see how great the book looks?
Sure, that's good. Shall I just start reading now, or should we put the pages up? All right, so I'll start reading now.
Sure.
Okay, this is a chapter entitled Braddocks Defeat. In 1755, the 7 Years' War between Britain and France began. It was fought in both Europe and North America, where General Edward Braddock was then commander of the British Army. Braddock planned an offensive against the French and their native allies, starting first with capturing French forts in Pennsylvania. Braddock had a low opinion of both natives and colonials. Prior to the campaign, he spoke with Benjamin Franklin, who warned him of the dangers in fighting natives. Braddock replied, "The savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the king's regular troops, it is impossible they should make any impression." For the offensive, 2 infantry regiments were sent from Ireland and 3 companies of soldiers from Britain. These 1,200 soldiers were joined by 800 colonial militia for a total of 2,000. Due in large part to his own arrogance, Braddock's defeat would be one of the greatest losses for the British Army in the 18th century. Starting from Fort Cumberland in Maryland on May 29, 1755, the Army had to move 2,000 troops and supplies, including cannons, through dense forest and mountainous terrain, a massive logistical challenge. The Army moved as little as 2 miles a day as a road was cut to accommodate horses, wagons, and artillery. With over 110 miles to cover, Braddock split off 1,200 soldiers to move ahead and left 800 with the supply train. As the French neared Fort Duquesne, the French and natives were alerted and dispatched a force to set an ambush at the Monongahela River. There were 100 French soldiers, 146 colonials, and 650 natives, including Shawnees, Lenapes, Potawatomis, and Senecas. The French native force ran into the advance elements of the British. As shots were fired, native warriors streamed along both sides of the British, taking high ground and opening a deadly fire from behind trees and other cover. Attempting to form massed ranks and standing out in their bright red coats, the British suffered staggering losses, with 456 killed and 422 wounded out of the 1,200. 26 of the dead were officers, 37 of whom were injured. The French saw just 8 killed and 4 wounded, while 15 native warriors were killed and 12 wounded. Among the British dead was General Edward Braddock. Braddock's defeat came to symbolize the arrogance of the British Empire and the failure of European forms of war in the eastern woodlands of North America. The next year, the first ranger units were established by the British Army, comprised of colonial settlers using native tactics. The most well-known was Rogers Rangers, led by Robert Rogers. These units were the basis of today's U.S. Army Special Operations Forces. And that's the end of that chapter.
Cool. Thanks, Gord. So firstly, congratulations on the new edition and the updates. Again, I know we were talking about this before, but it looks amazing. So I wanted to sort of start with talking a bit about Indigenous history and sort of, articulating Indigenous history through the format of a graphic novel. So what would you say that illustration brings to these narratives, and how did it change the way that you approached telling these stories?
Yeah, well, originally, I only started doing comics in the late '90s, I think. But before that, I did a lot of writing and I researched a lot, especially around 1992. It was the 500-year centenary or whatever anniversary of the invasion of the Americas. And at the time, I was producing newspapers and zines, and it ended up becoming a small booklet. I wrote a history of the 500 years. 500 years of resistance. Well, one thing I found about it is, like, especially among a lot of our people, I think oppressed people in general, our literacy rates can be a bit lower. I think it can be hard for people to take in this kind of history. There are people who read just text. But one thing I find about the graphic novels is I think it's a lot more engaging for people. I think there's less text for them to have to make their way through, and the visuals can really tell a lot of the story without having to place it in the text, like a picture is worth 1,000 words type of thing. So I think it just makes it really accessible for people. And I think for like young people who don't maybe have strong literacy skills, I think it brings this history to them at a reading level that's more appropriate and engaging. And I think for a lot of us as adults, even I think I have a fairly high reading skill level, but I really don't have the time with my work and my family obligations and stuff. So I think that's one of the really great things about the graphic novel is it just makes it so much more easier for people to read this history and to pick up the comic and grab, read a chapter maybe. So I think that's one of the main things about it. And also just like showing Indigenous peoples, like the strengths of their traditional culture, some of the things that they created in their daily lives and stuff like that, and showing them, as human beings, going about their daily lives, with all the flaws that we have as people and stuff like that. And anyway, that's what I think the graphic novel, it really enables me to bring out a lot of that type of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I love what you said about accessibility too, because you packed in what must have been, years and years of research into this graphic novel and really managed to condense it down into something that, as you said, is very accessible and manages to cover such a broad swath of not only history, but territory too. So really, really interesting approach, I think. Was there anything that you found particularly surprising or articulate or interesting about using the graphic novel as a format?
Um, not particularly. I mean, one concern I had about was the amount of graphic kind of violence in the
Right.
comic. But I mean, originally I was surprised that Arsenal published my first edition of the comic because of some of the violence that was in those stories. But I mean, that is such an integral part of colonialism that you can't really just erase it completely. Um, but I think I tried to do yeah, I tried to tone it down a little bit, but still try to keep the impact of it. Um, but in terms of the graphic novel itself, the one thing I was more surprised about, because I had a lot more access to resources for research and stuff this time around. And the one thing that really I was really not shocked, but definitely the story of the Mapuche resistance is like so inspiring, and the amount of fighting that they were able to carry out against the Spanish. You know, they were never conquered by the Spanish. They waged like 300 years of warfare against the Spaniards. And I just felt that was like something I was really, I learned a lot. I learned a lot making this comic, but I think the Mapuche was definitely the highlight for me. And I think people can learn a lot from their struggle. But yeah, I'd say that's about my biggest surprise.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the things that I love about this graphic novel in particular is that when you, I think, read about sort of Indigenous resistance in a lot of contemporary histories, it tends to be more sort of state-facing negotiations, litigation, that kind of thing, whereas you are really focusing on like militancy, militant resistance, warfare, sort of that kind of organization. So what made you decide to focus on sort of the more militant aspects of things rather than bringing in sort of later, appeals to the state, for example?
I think to start with, I mean, I view colonization as a form of warfare to gain and take territory and to take control and subjugate populations. So I think initially from the start, it involves this military conflict. And one of the things I think about when we look at the histories, if you look at a colonial history, they often minimize or erase Indigenous resistance to kind of to present colonialism as more of an honorable thing that they did. They brought all this civilization and they raised the standard of living of Indigenous people, even though there's this genocide. 90% of our populations died almost uniformly across the board. Every Indigenous nation suffered this massive decline in population. And so anyway, so it was counter that colonial narrative that it was this kind of meeting of two worlds. And yeah, there was a little bit of conflict, but then the diseases, and anyway, it's all kind of good. So I wanted to counter that. But there's another type of historical narrative, I think, that's maybe comes from more progressive people, but they really want to portray Indigenous peoples as just victims of genocide, helpless victims. They couldn't fight back against this overwhelming power that was so much superior to them. And I think both these narratives are they're not complete and they're not true. And so that's why I kind of focus on the militant resistance that our ancestors engaged in, because I think that's really important to maintain that history of resistance. Because if we don't maintain that history, then how can our present generations feel inspired by their ancestors or learn from the history or to carry out today's resistance? Because if you don't have the will to fight, then you can't engage in resistance. And if your view of your history is that you're so inferior to this invading force, then I think it really breaks down our fighting spirit, our warrior spirit. So that's kind of partly what I wanted to do, was to reinvigorate warrior spirit, but to inspire people today that they can look at the fights that our ancestors had, and that they were actually quite successful in many cases. And this idea that the Europeans just kind of came in and steamrolled over Indigenous peoples, I think is really false. And it's this resistance that our ancestors engaged in that enables us to actually carry out that what's happening today. It's all a result of that history. So that's kind of why I focused on the more militant aspects of resistance. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think one of the things that I really appreciated about 500 years of Indigenous resistance is that, you're definitely countering the stereotype of, the sort of degraded Indigenous person who, gets steamrolled by colonialism, but you also don't fall into the trope of the noble savage, right? Like, I think you make a really deliberate point of showing at various points that Indigenous peoples are not, without fault, right? Like, we're engaging in violence with one another as well. Sometimes we team up with colonial forces. Sometimes, we reject them. But, I think you do a really good job of showing sort of the complex socio-political dynamics that were already at play, and that also were strongly affected as the colonizers started, making their incursions. So was that a deliberate choice on your part as well? Or was that just history that you found interesting that you wanted to include?
Well, I mean, some of it's history that it's kind of relevant to how things played out, to like how different groups strategized and maneuvered between themselves in different groups, and it helps us understand history. And we certainly, I didn't want to have this thing that we were such perfect people, that we were living in a Garden of Eden and everything was really peaceful. I mean, that's kind of another. I think it comes from more progressive elements that want to have this romanticized idea of what Native people were or how we lived. But I mean, intertribal warfare was a part of our history as well. Especially here on the Northwest Coast, that was a major part of our way of life. And I could have expanded it a bit more and gone back into Europe to say, look at all the feudal kingdoms, you guys, hundreds of years of warfare and all this type of stuff. But I certainly didn't want to have this romanticized version of Native people that were, because we did engage in that type of stuff. So if I didn't include some of that, some people could look at the comic and say, oh, well, it's so biased. The Native people are just like such peaceful people. But I mean, that wasn't the case, that's for sure. And it was actually that warrior culture that is a part of our cultures is what enabled us to resist this European invasion to start with. So, and I think all peoples around the world, we all have flaws as humans, and every human society has flaws in that. So it's better for us to accept that and be realistic about it than to have some kind of false history.
Yeah. So I guess to continue with that point, I think one of the other things that you make a point of doing throughout the graphic novel is really explicitly highlighting Indigenous women as warriors and as leaders sort of throughout. That really stuck out for me. Can you speak to sort of both why it's important to have these focuses on Indigenous women in your texts or in your text, and sort of, what led you to kind of, include that particular history?
Well, I think with the first edition of the comic, it's the same kind of story. I focus on the kind of a lot of the military aspects, and in a lot of Indigenous societies, that the purely military campaigns were predominantly carried out by men, and by just focusing on the military aspect of things, it was easy to overlook women's contributions to this the overall community organizing that was necessary for resistance, and also in a lot of Indigenous nations. I mean, although it was primarily like a male role to be a warrior and to defend the village and all that type of stuff, there was a lot of Indigenous nations where women were actually participated in warfare. Not on a huge scale, but they did participate. The Mapuche, it was common for women to engage in battles, and among the Plains, you have a lot of stories of Native women that were warriors that participated in raids and that type of activities. So I wanted to have that, so that it wasn't just so male-dominated history because it's just the military stuff, but to show that women were part of that military struggle as well, and they also participated as warriors. And I think, because today, I think there's a lot of young women that participate in this resistance movement, and they are warriors. So I wanted to kind of show that this is part of our culture. It's part of our traditional culture and history, rather than not say anything about that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, I think that's the main reason. I just didn't want it to just be all male male actors, because I think women played a much bigger role than these military histories would show.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think, one of the things I really appreciated about that was, sort of coming up and being involved in various movements and that kind of thing. You encounter this rhetoric that, women shouldn't be participating in direct action, for example, because it's like masculinist to be militant and that kind of thing. And, looking at our histories, looking at the history of my people, you see like Métis women's militancy sort of throughout our history, right? As you kind of mentioned, right? Being part of the battles, not just sort of behind the lines making bullets and that kind of thing, but sometimes on the front lines, riding out to, meet in these skirmishes and to fight the Canadian expansion, right? So yeah, no, I love that you made that connection with people today, and young women in particular today, because, I think that finally, we're starting to that stereotype, that rhetoric that women shouldn't be militant is finally starting to get broken down. And I think that this is a good narrative to show that, this isn't like some kind of response to colonialism or because of colonialism, that's part of our traditions, is that women can also be militant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of that stuff that's in our movements today it comes from this patriarchal European culture that has been imposed upon us, and people have this distorted ideas of how our communities were organized, and they think it was just men did all the organizing, men did everything. It's just so ridiculous.
Yeah, totally. So sort of, I guess, in line with that, what were sort of both the literary and then the community inspirations for this work? Was there a particular moment that you realized that you needed to tell these stories?
Well, originally the comic book started as short little zines I was doing, and that's why they're in black and white, 8 by 11 pages. I started doing these because I thought that I was involved in the Native youth movement, and we're doing all this organizing, and there was youth who hadn't really heard of Ipperwash. This is like in the late 90s. So they hadn't really heard about Ipperwash. They had a vague idea about Oka in 1990 and that. So I started making these little comics so we could distribute at conferences or powwows or wherever we were organizing. And so after a while, I had a collection of these comics, and someone suggested I put them together to make a bigger 500 years comic. So I did that, but that's originally what the purpose of it was they were just short comics that I was easily to distribute. People if they could get into the band office, they could make Xerox copies of these zines. So that was originally the purpose.
Okay. Oh, that's cool. Yeah, no, it really seems like, your focus has always been about sort of that consciousness raising among the youth.
These comics were mostly to keep that history of resistance and to inspire people. And I always try to have stuff that like practical stuff that we could learn from. So that's why there's like the tactical level of things, like what were some of the basic tactics that groups used. I mean, some of them aren't really relevant to us today, but we can get ideas from them. The main thing for me is just that history of resistance, I think, is really important for our psychology as a people. That's the main reason I think I did it.
Yeah. And then what inspired you to do this updated version now?
Okay. Yeah. Well, so those comics, the black and white comics that went into the first edition, I mean, I was drawing those in the late 90s. So that's like over 20 years ago. And I hadn't really focused on doing comics. I was doing a lot of graphics for movement stuff, black and white graphics like logos and t-shirt graphics and stuff like that, poster graphics. So I wasn't really concentrating on doing comic art. And so I did that. I did those comics. So I did the pages, and then Arsenal printed the comic. And to be honest, when I look at that comic, I can't even look at that comic now because I'm just so critical of my art and also some of the text, which was just so incorrect. So I really wanted to do honor to this history and redo it with the skills that I have now, because I've been doing comics a lot for the last 4 or 5 years, maybe. And my skills have gotten a lot better just because that I'm doing so much more comics. And I took a lot more time to study, basic anatomy and how to draw comic panels and stuff like that, perspective and things like that. And so that's why I really wanted to redo the comic. And I asked Arsenal a couple of years ago if they would be into doing that, and they were. And another part of that is like my comic was the first one that Arsenal published as a graphic novel. And then over the years, they've done a lot more now. And they've learned a lot about publishing graphic novels too. So this edition that's been published, it's like my artwork is better, the writing is better, it's better researched, and Arsenal has put more resources into the actual the physical production of the book. So it just makes me feel so much better to have this version of the comic like that I can give to people rather than the old version, which I just had to redo it.
Yeah, fair. Was there any particular source that you went to for these histories?
No, because they're so varied, all these different histories. There's not one single book that I could pick up that would give me this information. I had to go to all kinds of different sources. Like I got my books in my little library here, had to do a lot of internet researching. I mean, some of the Taino material, I don't really see too much printed material, but there's websites that are maintained by Taino people that talk about their culture and things like that. So those are really good resources. And that became a big part of my resource that I turned to, because I just found such little information elsewhere. Or there's the histories written mostly by Spanish colonizers. And so we got that history, but then I can go, with the Taino, I could go back and look at the Taino to see what it was their version of this battle, even, or especially with the Mapuche. I think there's a lot more kind of documentation of the Mapuche. So that was some of the things. Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess to sort of lead us out here, and I know that you've spoken about this a little bit already, but sort of for the general readership that's going to pick up this new version of 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance, what are you hoping that people walk away with when they read your book?
I mean, in general, I hope they walk away with a fuller understanding or grasp of this process of colonialism. But I think, especially for Indigenous people, I hope they take away from this, inspiration that they're, the strength of their ancestors, and that's what enables us to survive as people today. And to just, I don't know, I just hope they really, I just hope they're really inspired to, and to engage in resistance movements of today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I really hope.
Cool, great. And maybe just to close us out, if folks want to find out more about, sort of what you're writing about, particular instances or whatever, do you have any sort of favorite resources that you like to point people to?
Not really, but I mean, just for like some general things, but the thing about a lot of the histories is they're very specific to regions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would recommend Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee to start, because it's so well documented, and it can be a really hard read for people.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found with that history is it can be really hard to read, to struggle through it, because there's some of the older books, the colonizer, written by colonizers. I mean, the language is so racist. So I can understand why a lot of Native people don't even want to get into some of these books. So, I mean, I go through those books, but I mean, if you're really serious about history, you have to read those accounts. That's a part of the historical record.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't really recommend them all the time because they're so racist.
Mm-hmm. It's weird reading those because it's terrible, but then you get these little nuggets, right?
Yeah, there's some books like, I think, Conquest of Paradise. Now it's sympathetic to Indigenous peoples, but it's very, very broad. But that's another book I would recommend too. And it covers some regions and at a kind of a bigger scale, a larger scale. Yeah, that I would recommend that book. Yeah, I can't really think of any others off the top of my head, but I mean, there are a lot of books out there about particular nations too. But
Mm,
yeah, I mean, those two I would recommend. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Conquest of Paradise, to get started, maybe.
yeah, totally.
I mean, there's other books that are more contemporary, maybe like Agents of Repression by Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall, which goes through the repression of the American Indian movement and the Black Panther Party. People of the Pines, which is a really good account of the 1990 Oka crisis by Jeffrey York. It's a fairly sympathetic book to that struggle. Yeah, there's some, I guess.
Yeah. No, I'm always just looking for more ways to dive into those rabbit holes, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for sitting down to chat with me. Is there anything else before we wrap up that you wanted to say at all?
No, I hope everybody's doing well, and with all the social conditions we're living under, I think people should really be thinking about the future that we're facing, and trying to gather their resources and strengthen themselves for. I think there's hard times coming up, and I think people should be thinking about that for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you. And for everybody watching and listening, thank you for joining us. And you can pick up the new version of 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book at your local bookstore. So, I missed a hey.
Alakasla.